both autonomy and consciousness in the people who are engaged in constantly coping with their environment, which we call it a living, and therefore medicine must smother health. The same can be said in every domain where the autonomous production of use value and the heteronomous production of exchange value are in conflict, as they are now more and more in more and more sectors. This is my hypothesis about the so-called crisis in which we are. The synergy of these two modes of production, autonomous I do, and heteronomous I things, staple things made for me, remains positive only as long as technological inputs increase the effectiveness on both sides of the balance, on both sides of the scale. Unfortunately, this is not what is happening. Because of an ideological prejudice in favor of centralized, as you just said, professional production, technological advance is almost inevitably put at the disposal of an increased effectiveness on the heteronomous side, on the industrial side, into the industrial mode of production. As soon as technological progress benefits the mass production of staples for people and does so beyond a certain proportion, people's ability to fend for themselves cannot but decline, because society is rearranged for maximum effectiveness in industrial production. Society is drafted as an entity into the service of industry. Law then becomes a tool for the social engineering of producers and consumers. And politics becomes a squabble about who gets more, even though now all can do less on their own. In other words, the synergy of autonomous activity and heteronomous delivery, or if you want to put it in other words, of personal doing and institutional making, the synergy between the two major modes of production, in the case of such an unbalance, gives negative returns. And this synergy, this negative result of synergy between industrial and autonomous production, results in a misery of a new kind. This is what is new about the moment which we are living. Educated stupidity, iatrogenic ill health, high-speed wastage of time, luxury imprisonment, institutionally liberated sex, informational overload. These are all products of negative institutional synergy. I believe, and this is where I risk to state a hypothesis, that contemporary famine belongs to the same ilk of misery. The hunger which creates the world, which threatens the world, is a new kind of phenomenon. Of course, hunger is one of the oldest companions of man. But I do believe that we cannot really manage what we are facing during the next 10 or 15 years unless we see in which sense it is new. We remain powerless to counter it unless we understand that the famine which comes is unlike any famine of old. This point, I know, is difficult to make and difficult to swallow. And I beg, if there are again some of our colleagues here who were here last time, who on this point see different from me, forgive me for rubbing it in again. It's difficult to make and difficult to swallow because people who are done in by hunger tend all to look alike, and all evoke in us the urge to provide them with a bowl of soup. We have simply not been trained to distinguish the personal neighbor, this guy who is hungry, from the ad in the paper representing the victim of an impersonal catastrophe somewhere else. We are easily talked into, but look here, this is a kid whom you should help. Look how he looks. Industrial and missionary vanity and presumption have grown hand in hand over the last 150 years. Imperialism and missionarism. The conviction that the rich must be able to help the poor. The time now has come to understand that the family next door can eat well for Christmas if I hand them 10 pounds, perhaps. While famine in Bengal requires that we all, I first always, give up not only cars, perhaps flying in jet planes too, first of all. Now, professional do-gooders systematically confuse this issue. We fill the papers with pictures of bloated bellies and matchstick limbs, and piously appeal to you to close your eyes to the structural issue which is facing us by giving £1 for bureaucratic administration of relief, which will be very effective and decent indeed. The issue I want to bring to your attention cannot be grasped by you unless you renounce, we all renounce, in deep anguish, to be conviction that we must have somehow the power to help. And then we understand that there is nothing we can do for people who this year, next year, and the year after will die. You understand why I'm worried about this and said I would like to discuss this, but in a milieu in which we are among ourselves, because I'm raising something which is just very difficult to put into words. What I want to discuss is the epidemic starvation which now decimates the marginal majorities of an industrialized mankind, which has been inescapably stabulated in a landscape of sterile concrete, and which is increasingly fed from mechanized farms. I want to explore if there are limits to man's stabulation, capacity for stabulation. I remember, my goodness, it's 30 years ago, 31 years ago, 42 years ago, my war experiences was saving Tuscany cows. Yes, that was my hero's war. And to find out where the Germans would requisition cows and then somehow get them out of the stable and into the macchia. Which wasn't an easy job to do, because these were stabulated cows. And cows, which for generations grow in stables, can't walk their hoofs off in a few miles. When I therefore speak about the ability of man to resist stabulation, it is this kind of experience which I want to talk about. Now, obviously by what I've said, if I said it properly, I've not only touched upon something which is obscenum, which really doesn't fit on the table of a decent discussion, and on the other hand I've said something which very easily sounds as a call back to nature. What was the man who came today to interview me, and he wanted to discuss Medical Nemesis. He said, but I didn't have really time to read it, but I have to write about it, so let me read what's on the back of it. He hadn't done even that. And then he said, what kind of health foods do you eat? I told him I don't. He said, well, you jog, no? No, I don't want to. When I speak about what I want to do is to raise the hypothesis that a law which seems to apply in 5 or 6 other areas where I've carefully thought it through, namely that there are 2 modes of production, and when one prevails, the heteronomous mode prevails, total effectiveness becomes negative. If that is applicable in the field of food production. Now, as soon as I say this, people say, well, hell, you're speaking about something which is totally impossible. We can't go back and raise our own food. After all, city people never did. Now, this is not true. we tend to forget that until quite recently, very few people lived on packaged and marketed stall-fed fodder. I still am struggling for the right words to speak about this. Not only the peasant was engaged in the production of food, the typical 18th century townsman contributed sizably to his own subsistence or sustenance. On his garbage and the crumbs from his table, he raised chicken and rabbits in Europe and carps in the East. Pigs and goats contributed warmth to his home. Backyards were common, with fruit trees and vegetable gardens. Many burghers had at least a family, if not property, just beyond the city gates. And I remember living in a college in the very center of Rome, behind Montecitorio, where the rules which were read to us every year at the beginning of the year so that the newcomers would know about them, forbade during the half-hour interruption to walk out into the vineyards. We sometimes forget about the size of traditional cities, even Rome. Excepting a few ports, I didn't dare to say this until very recently, but I think I'm not wrong. Until very recently, 99% of the grain, oil, wine, and fruit came from within the horizon one could survey from the town steeple, not to speak about the wood and charcoal needed for its cooking. I'm speaking of city dwellers. Besides cattle and salt, which sometimes came from afar, but was precious and rare, and also, of course, pepper and drugs, which were light and very precious, food did not travel from region to region. But more significant for our purpose is the fact that only a very limited part of the local food passed over the market. I accept here a few port cities. Only soldiers, slaves, and the wretchedly poor had to rely on purchase, on theft, or on handouts. Urbanization was limited. And town markets only supplemented the diet of city dwellers, who still produced always part of their own sustenance. The literature on this subject is rather new for me. I do hope that in your milieu I'll get more of it. When famine struck, food of course vanished from the market. Its price shot up 3 to 12-fold. Such an increase was steep enough to starve rich and poor alike. There just was no food. Food was gone. Stocks might save the king's men in a fortified stronghold, but for most people famine was an inescapable fate, moderated only by what they could produce in a domestic way, in the domestic mode of production. How well is Salins known here now? Marshall Salins, Stone Age Economics. One moment. Who of you has read that? You please put it out. And this is a discovery for me. It's already 2 years on the market. I discovered it last year. Salins, S-A-H-L-I-N-S. If there is a Stone Age Economics. For me, it's one of the most enlightening books I've seen. A survey of the literature on Paleolithic people then and now, that is from archaeology and ethnology, and an attempt to study their production in a from a strictly economist's point of view, coming to surprising results. I'm not saying that we should go back to the Stone Age. With Paul Goodman, I'm saying I'm a conservative Neolithic, but not a Paleolithic. Food traditionally was immobile, except by waterway. When famine became severe, people moved in search of food. In northeastern Brazil, people still land in the slums of the seashore if they don't die on the way when drought strikes. Periodic starvation cruelly kept each region's population within each region's nurturing potential. The obvious necessity to live off the soil and of course of the sun available in a certain circle, which was determined essentially by the donkey's autonomy, became a material parameter for the development of most peasant cultures. The rules governing land reform, marriage, child rearing, and dying can be interpreted in each culture as devices to ensure survival of a well-knit group, hedged in and kept down by famine. The relationship of man to hunger changed radically only during the railroad age. Food became mobile. A world market in foodstuff became possible. The new possibility of long-distance feeding not only called forth a new capital-intensive, mechanized kind of farming, but principally, and this is the issue I want to take up, a new fantasy about human interdependence, that which I called the missionary imperialist conviction about the rich man's power to help. A pest or a famine in Bengal was for two reasons a different experience in the time of Nelson and in the time of Disraeli. Before the telegraph could report on it, the apocalyptic rider of death might have passed before his appearance had been really noticed in London. And anyway, famine relief out of London could never be effective. Last year's famine in the Sahel was quite different. Londoners knew about its coming. 2 years before, one Tuareg really could speak about it, at least in the language of London. And they knew all the time more about it in more detail than anybody in High Volta or Niger. We know that the pet food which is used in England, just that much, if it were transported at 3% of the vacation air travel done in 1973, could have provided the emergency staples needed. No question about that. At first sight, this would seem that famine could be conjured by inter-regional assistance or by outright gift, in which combines, agricultural combines, and transfer belts are standard. In fact, this is wistful thinking. It is wistful thinking developed to protect the rich man's confidence in his industrial delusion. There are limits within which Bengalis can survive on grains from the Punjab, not to speak from grains from Kansas. The recent FAO meeting even has finally given official recognition to this fact, that disaster can be alleviated by shipment from stocks, but only to relieve occasional failures, if the region in itself is self-supporting. I see that I have talked longer than I wanted to. So let me sum up the end somewhat shorter than I had planned, because we want to come into conversation. I do believe, I'm quite willing to go back and elaborate this later on during questions, but I hadn't noticed my time limit, which had gone over. I never presented this whole argument to a group in this detail. I believe that if we apply the hypothesis of the two modes of production and of negative synergy which sets in when one mode outgrows the balance, to the agricultural production of food, we would need to find some parameters according to which we can define when agricultural production, inevitably mechanized production, must become counterproductive. I have played around and would like during the seminar in Cuernavaca this year to discuss two hypotheses. One would be to figure out what percentage of the total food value needed in a large